see that every day. Welcome to the hard sell, but a stick in the swill-bucket rattles back. Today it's another Pavlov's Bell episode. Pavlov's Bell is where we look at tropes, characters, icons of all kinds, and how they've been employed in advertising. Movie references, literary references, historical characters, eggplants, whatever. Today, if for some reason you haven't already guessed, we're looking at Kaiju.
Godzilla, king of the monsters.
You know, giant rampaging monsters from Godzilla on down. The Japanese word for them is Kaiju. And Godzilla isn't just the most famous, he practically invented the genre. His first movie in 1954 was basically the first Kaiju film of all. And it's a surprisingly bleak film as well, at least if you're used to the American dub. It's played enormously straight. This original version of the big guy is basically an enormous metaphor on legs. It's easy to forget after 75 years of nuclear paranoia, but Japan is the one and only country who have actually had nuclear weapons used against them. And with the greatest of respect, long may they remain so. The original Godzilla movie came out less than a decade after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The swathe of destruction he cuts through Tokyo resembles the ones the bomb sent through those cities, only in agonizing slow motion. This isn't an accident. No wonder the dubbed version from the country that actually dropped the bomb removes most of the heavy stuff and replaces it with shots of Raymond Burr commentating on things he can't see. It was still incredibly popular, and in his homeland, instantly iconic. He was particularly popular among Japanese children, which is one of the reasons why future instalments were less allegorical and realistic, and concentrated more on the joy of smashing stuff. There were still topical and even political allusions, usually in the makeup of the various other monsters Godzilla had to fight. Hedorah the Smog Monster, for instance, or the genetically engineered Biollante the Angry Flower. But generally, Godzilla settled into the mass consciousnesses of both East and West as a symbol of nothing so much as cheerful, wanton destruction. Which is where this show comes in. We're not looking at marketing for Godzilla, either his 8 dozen films or his various spin-offs.
Godzilla, 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 and Godzuki.
There, I included Godzuki. Happy? No, we're looking at adverts for random things that use Godzilla's image. Or more accurately, the image of Kaiju in general. Giant smashing monsters can make for good mascots. They emphasise how great and how far above its rivals your product is. They both represent and provide pure power without you having to work at it. It's a useful shortcut if you can make it work. One of the most famous advertising Kaiju, certainly in the UK, is probably Chewie the Chewitsaurus, or the Muncher, to give his original name. Chewits are your average compacted glucose and fruit juice chewy sweet. They've been around since 1963 in some form or another. Surprisingly, they're not a brand owned by Nestle's or Mars or the Kraft cast-offs at Mondelez, but by a relatively modest Swedish company. They're one of the most successful confectionery products, at least in the UK, not to come out of the big conglomerates. And Chewy, or the Muncher, has to be a major reason why. They've never advertised without him, ever since the very first television commercial for Chewits back in 1976.
Run for your lives! The Muncher is coming!
He's eating everything in his path!
This is the end of civilization as we know it.
Not quite, Professor. It's a long shot, but it might just work.
Come back, Chuck. Come back.
Chewits, even chewier than a 15-story block of flats.
This sort of pastiche was quite original 45 years ago, especially done this well. From the film stock to the carefully Harryhausen-esque stop motion, right down to the camera work and, in particular, not even bothering low-energy acting, with which anyone who's seen enough 1950s B-movies or Kevin Costner films post-1994 or so will be intimately familiar.
Not quite, Professor. It's a long shot, but it might just work.
My boat. Chewett's duly flew off the shelves, probably killing off Spangles for good in the process. This advert was so popular that instead of making a follow-up immediately, they just extended its run. They did eventually make another one, of course, around the dawn of the 80s, which was even more popular, particularly in Barren Furnace.
We took the Muncher to some of the best places to eat in the world. He ate the Taj Mahal. Yeah. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yeah. The Empire State Building. But none of these delicious buildings could match the 5 chewy flavors of Chewits. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Chewits are even chewier than Barrow in Furnace bus depot.
This also ran for a long time, well into the mid-80s of my own childhood. I remember seeing it on TVAM and the like, not understanding a word of it, but being faintly intimidated by the way it ended on a snarl. I know it's supposed to be a smile, but to me it always came across as a snarl. Maybe this was a concern in general, because in 1987 he was redesigned by the good folks at Aardman Animations to look more expressive, brightly coloured and benign.
London's under siege. But beware, this gobbling brute is a master of disguise.
Yeah, matey.
Do not confront him. Always carry your regulation Chewits. There's nothing chewier. And keep the enemy from your door. Chewits, chew for victory.
While the premise of the adverts themselves was shifted a little from the aesthetics of Godzilla films and 1950s B-movies to that of wartime British propaganda and Mr. Chumley Warner, although to be fair, Harry Enfield hadn't invented him yet.
Here, 2 extra Chewits is still only 10 pence.
Remember, loose talk costs news agents. Chewits, chew for victory.
This big-eyed, bright green version of the Muncher has more or less informed his various redesigns to some extent or another ever since. He even got his own video game for the Spectrum. Sort of. It's pretty obviously just some levels from Rampage, slightly recoloured and with a Chewits ad at the start. He didn't even redraw the sprite. It wasn't long before the Muncher became an essentially benevolent, if destructive, character, which was a little harder to square with the old-timey newsreel feel.
Introducing the essential guide to a chewier chew. First, try Wellington boots. Then try a rubber boat. Then sample a rubber plant. Then, and only then, will you be ready for the 6 chewy fruit flavors of Chewits. Chewits! No fruit chew, choose chewier!
Perhaps because of this, they took a hard left turn in 1996 or so, apparently employing the newly redundant cast as spitting image to create a bizarre parallel dimension society of dinosaurs, where Chewits are the single most important thing in the world. And also have strange properties.
Good evening. Now that big tasting Chewits are even chewier, you must take precautions. Bernard. Before you chew these, you must do this. 1, 2, chew. This young chap ignored our advice. Clive, unless you wear approved protective headwear, you must do it before you chew it. Goodness me. Do I say? Get back after the break.
On paper, at least, it was an interesting attempt at taking an established image and doing something new with it. But in practice, it was just confusing and off-putting. So, by the turn of the century, they went back to the regular rampaging Godzilla action, only now in highly stylised 2D animation, and with the Muncher renamed Chewie the Chewitsaurus, and the most obvious soundtrack imaginable. This is very much the Godzilla the friend to children side of the kaiju trope, which actually originated with a turtle named Gamera, a rip-off of Godzilla that ended up being ripped off by Godzilla. As for Chewie, this has been pretty much his thing ever since, give or take one or two new redesigns. It's basically impossible to imagine Chewits without him.
Next. Next. Thank you. Next. 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 You've got the job!
Chewits, for monster chewers only. Now in bags.
Understandably, kaiju are particularly common advertising tropes in their homeland of Japan, where they're obviously as standard and everyday a symbol as, say, Doctor Who or Supermarionation or Coronation Street are in the UK. So they get things like this for Hitachi.
近頃主人の帰りがなんだか早いんです。あ、小島さん。番組録画して自分だけのカラオケテープ作ったりして。
Obviously, I have no idea precisely what's going on here, or what any of the moon language means, but the basic premise and/or joke comes through: the everyday life of Godzilla. A standard absurdism in the West, but with extra resonance in Japan, where the salaryman is as much of a trope as Godzilla himself. Combining the two was probably funnier and more powerful for Japanese viewers at the time, in ways we gaijin could never fully grasp.
ラララ今度は歌える G ビデオラララ
新登場
すごい簡単気持ちいい
Hitachi.
Quick look at marketing tie-ins now. Godzilla made his comeback after nearly a decade in 1984, which out of a sense of tradition was then given the same American redub treatment as the original, complete with extraneous Raymond Burr, although it was impossible not to see him as Perry Mason. Anyway, while in the 50s the main motivation behind the US version was simply filling the slates at the local drive-in, this being the 80s, it was all about products, and the making of money via product. Prominent amongst them was inexplicable fizzy abomination Dr. Pepper, who splashed out not only on spurious vending machines in the Pentagon in the film itself, but an advert starring the real thing.
We must stop Godzilla before he destroys the city. Oh, what could he want? Unless we find something to appease him. We're doomed! Hold out, out of the ordinary. Hold out for Dr. Pepper.
Lucky there was a giant can of the stuff where a water tower should have been. No one ever said these things needed to make sense. I could go into the deranged marketing of the 1998 Hollywood film as well. But that would take an episode in itself. Possibly. Not a promise.
I think I need a bigger box.
Okay, but I called this episode Kaiju. not Godzilla specifically. Well, there's a reason Godzilla is known as the king of monsters. Most kaiju references are actually Godzilla references. You're not likely to see Hedorah or Biollante or Ebirah the Horror of the Deep in an advert, because they're not instantly recognisable the way Godzilla is. Or, conversely, the way any building-sized dinosaur thing is, as Godzilla. Just possibly you could stretch to a Mothra or a Rodan, but even then, only if you can't use the big guy himself. So why didn't I call this episode Godzilla? Except to show off that I know what the technical term is? Because I wanted to include this chap. Godzilla was the original kaiju in the radioactive city-smashing Japanese idiom, but he was far from the first gigantic rampaging creature in movie history. More than 20 years before Godzilla, there was Kong, eighth wonder of the world, who has his own set of tropes and imagery. Despite being an American creation and a pre-atomic one, he was grandfathered into the canon of kaiju early in Godzilla's career, and of course they spent another movie beating the shit out of each other just recently. So yes, he counts. His imagery's not all that dissimilar to Godzilla's. They find him on a Pacific island, yes, which he proceeds to beat up. But the most iconic moment there is his fight with the dinosaur, and obviously that's conflated in the mass consciousness with any number of confrontations with the real Godzilla himself. The stuff that's actually iconic and really unique is the proto-kaiju rampage in New York in the film's third act. He climbs buildings rather than pulling them down, but then he can't breathe fire. And he's usually at least slightly smaller than the buildings as well, although the films aren't exactly consistent on this point. All this can make for a great dramatic setup for your product, a built-in automatic giant for it to fell. Literally in some cases.
Energizer batteries keep going and go.
Alternatively, you can use the sheer power of the monster the other way, by depicting your product as the only one good enough, not to mention big enough, for the likes of Kong.
If you've been looking high and low for a big car as good as a Volkswagen, maybe you should look into our big car, the Volkswagen 411. It has some things no Volkswagen ever had, like 4 big doors and lots of room and luxury for the whole family. It has some advanced things most cars don't have, like electronic fuel injection, an automatic preheating system, and a big trunk up front. But you don't have to be a genius to drive the 411, because it comes with an automatic transmission, also as standard equipment. So now, there's a Volkswagen big enough for just about everyone. The Volkswagen 411 4-door sedan.
Again, no one ever said these things had to make sense. I don't have a date for this one, but I'd be very surprised if it didn't come out in 1976, around the time of the ill-advised De Laurentiis remake. Either way, it's better, even if its Kong is the wrong kind of ape. Kong has one advantage over Godzilla, which is his anthropomorphism, i.e. he's a gorilla, he's human-shaped. Parallels can be drawn, inferences made. In particular, you can use him as an emblem of strength and toughness, and toxic masculinity, as in this Ford advert from Thailand.
ผู้ชายต้องแกร่ง Ford Ranger Open Cap.
And again, that works the other way too. If the idea of your product is to make its consumers tougher and more resilient in some way, there's no better way of showing that than by having someone like Kong act intimidated by it.
On a morning like this, nothing beats sliced banana and lashings of ice-cold milk, all served up on your Weetabix. Have you had your Weetabix?
And then you can rotate that again by having the icon behave out of character until exposed to the product. In fact, this one rotates it twice. What?
How do you know? Yeah, Godzilla! Oh, there he goes!
Who was that? Godzilla's actually pretty cool. Except when he's hungry.
Quit for all the Snickers!
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
You see what I mean? He's Godzilla. He's acting in character when he's smashing shit up. Not when he's getting puzzled on crispy Stellas and riding dune buggies without due care and attention. Do not attempt. Snickers has revolved it the other way. Partly for the joke and partly for the sake of having him as a sympathetic character. The American equivalent of Salaryman Godzilla from the Hitachi advert. Dude bro Godzilla. It's not really an evolutionary leap forward, but that's advertising for you. It's fundamentally about sending out very simple messages. Hey dumbbell, buy this. So it brings any and all symbols in its vicinity down to the most simple level it can. And, if possible, its viewers as well. Just to be sure. In many ways, it's a rampaging kaiju in itself. But a metaphorical one. Which is back to front. You've been watching a Bob the Fish production. Thanks! If you haven't found it already, be sure to check out our website at bobthefish.org.uk. Literally hundreds of videos not unlike this one that will make you laugh, think and realise new things or your money back. Which works out great because they're all absolutely free. All of this is possible thanks to the not unique way that Bob the Fish productions are paid for by you, the viewing public, via Patreon. For a donation of as little as £1 a month, not only do you ensure that I still have food and shelter so I can carry on making these programmes, but you could become eligible for a whole host of cool extras. New video essays, special event live streams, all my content a week in advance, and my book on the history of the BBC, Rule the Waves, chapter by chapter as it's written. And some cake, if you go out and buy a cake and eat it while you're watching. And if you don't want to support on a monthly basis, you can make a one-off donation via coffee. It all helps stave off scurvy. bobthefish.org.uk. You make it what it is.